Hello, everybody, and welcome to History Bite number 233, dated April 20th, 2021. I'm Walter, your mobile historian and blue-collar scholar. This History Bite is entitled The Supreme Court Appointments of President Ronald Reagan. President Reagan holds a special place in my heart by virtue of the fact that he was our chief executive when I came into the world in 1985. Indeed, Ronald Wilson Reagan served as America's 40th president from January 20th, 1981 until January 20th, 1989. During his 2 terms in the White House, President Reagan made 3 appointments to the Supreme Court and elevated one of its members to Chief Justice. All right? In the process of doing so, he replaced the following individuals: Justice Potter Stewart, who had been appointed by President Eisenhower in 1958, Chief Justice Warren E. Burger, who had been elevated to Chief by President Nixon in 1969, and Associate Justice Lewis Powell, who had been appointed to the court in 1972, also by President Nixon. So President Reagan's appointments to the court would have a far-reaching impact on the development of American law well beyond his years in the White House. As a matter of fact, when I was growing up, essentially we had the Reagan-Bush court, because the majority of appointees to the Supreme Court at that point, when I was growing up in the late 80s and throughout the 90s, were Reagan and Bush appointees. And indeed, the law certainly had a very conservative bend during those years. All right, so let's get to it. All right, when Ronald Reagan became president on January 20th, 1981, his first chance to appoint a member to the U.S. Supreme Court came with the retirement of Justice Potter Stewart in 1981. Again, Stewart had been appointed to the court in 1958 by President Eisenhower and was retiring at the fairly young age of 66. All right. During the campaign trail, President Reagan had promised during a low point in his campaign that he would appoint the first woman ever to the Supreme Court of the United States. And he decided to fulfill that campaign promise with his very first opportunity. All right. And so President Reagan would ultimately choose Arizona Court of Appeals Judge Sandra Day OConnor for the position. Now, Sandra Day OConnor had previously served as an Arizona state legislator, a trial judge, and now an appellate judge in her home state. And more or less, her qualifications were pretty much the same as Judge Mildred Lilly in California, who had been strongly considered for the court back in 1971, a decade earlier, by President Nixon. Indeed, O'Connor was no more qualified than Lilly was at the time of her proposed nomination. And the only thing essentially that held Judge Mildred Lilly back was her gender. Like I said in the video about President Nixon's appointees, it just wasn't time yet, so to speak, for a woman to be on the Supreme Court in the minds of many. Like I said, I don't agree with that, but probably most American policymakers in 1971 felt that way, as did Chief Justice Warren Burger. All right. But by 1981, attitudes had changed, and thus President Reagan, was, actively pushed to keep that word, and he nominated Sandra Day OConnor to replace the retiring Justice Potter Stewart on July 1st, 1981. Indeed, there was not a significant amount of opposition to her nomination. All right, some conservatives warned that she might be too liberal, especially with abortion rights, because she was a woman. So I guess, they're drawing, a presumption that it had little foundation in it. But aside from that, she more or less came through unscathed and was confirmed by the U.S. Senate by a 99-0 vote on September 21st, 1981. All right, thus becoming the court's first female justice, but certainly not the last. All right. There's an interesting little statement made about the retirement of Potter Stewart and him being succeeded by Sandra Day OConnor, and it goes as follows: Justice Potter Stewart, his chivalry can't be beat. The only Supreme Court justice to give a lady his seat. That's cute. I like that. And at that point, he indeed was the only Supreme Court justice in American history who had been succeeded by a lady. All right. Justice Sandra Day OConnor would serve on the court until her retirement at the very beginning of 2006. All right. And during her time on the bench, she was a powerful swing vote, especially in the 1990s and in the early 2000s. During the 1980s, she was a pretty reliably conservative vote, so she didn't disappoint her supporters. But, by the 1990s and early 2000s, she was certainly a swing vote, especially in the areas of civil rights, voting rights, gay rights, and other hot-button areas, and church and state separation as well. All right. So Justice O'Connor certainly left a powerful and positive impact on the Supreme Court of the United States. So President Reagan's next opportunity to appoint a justice came in 1986. Having won re-election in 1984, President Reagan got his second opportunity with the retirement of Chief Justice Warren Burger. Burger had, of course, been elevated to the Supreme Court in 1969 as its Chief Justice by President Richard Nixon. Burger had previously served as a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, was a moderate conservative throughout his 17 years on the Supreme Court. When he decided to retire, Reagan considered appointing several individuals for the spot, including Sandra Day OConnor and Byron White, both serving as associate justices. But ultimately, he settled on Associate Justice William Rehnquist. All right, a very controversial choice indeed. All right, and he was drawn to Rehnquist because Reagan, of course, promised to appoint strict constructionists, diabolical conservatives to the court, and Rehnquist certainly fit the bill for that. And Rehnquist was nominated to the court on June 20th, 1986 as its Chief Justice. Okay? Now, with Rehnquist being elevated, that left an Associate Justice seat open, which we'll get to after covering Rehnquist. All right? Giving Reagan his third appointment, okay? So when Rehnquist was nominated, this time to be Chief Justice, it unleashed the hellhounds, so to speak, all right? Numerous groups and organizations came out against Rehnquist's elevation as Chief Justice. Like I said in the video about President Nixon's appointments, Rehnquist had been appointed to the court in 1971 by President Nixon and had faced, serious confirmation troubles at that point, and it was no different when he was elevated to chief. All of his shady activities and, his obvious judicial conservatism and opposition to civil rights and labor, and a whole litany of other things would soon come back to haunt him yet again, indeed. But the most damning thing to come back against Rehnquist was happened decades before he himself was on the court, but instead from what happened in 1952 when he was serving as a law clerk to then Associate Justice Robert Jackson. Rehnquist had penned a memo, all right, for Jackson during the course of the time when the Brown versus Board of Education suit was pending before the court. And the memo stated that, written by Rehnquist, that he felt that Plessy versus Ferguson, the infamous separate but equal case, should be affirmed. Now, Rehnquist, of course, tried to dodge this issue by saying that these views were not his own, but rather those were Jackson's views, all right? Rehnquist was trying to push off on Jackson what presumably he felt, all right, asserting that, as clerks, it's the job of a clerk to summarize the justice's views, not his, all right? Certain people believed him, certain people didn't. And, the opposition to his nomination, like I said, was just as fierce and vicious in 1986 as Chief Justice as it was in 1971 when he was put on the court as an associate justice. All right. Ultimately, though, once again, it was not enough to derail the nomination, and Rehnquist was confirmed as Chief Justice on September 17th, 1986, all right, by a vote of 65 to 33, which is actually almost the same as it was in 1971 when he was confirmed as an associate justice. All right, so he once again came through, with largely party line vote. All right. Rehnquist would, of course, serve in his position as Chief Justice until his death in 2005. That's something I remember very well. He had been basically the Chief Justice for my whole life up to that point, And throughout his time on the court, Rehnquist was a reliable, unrelenting conservative, hardcore conservative, only exceeded essentially, outdone at times rather by the very man who President Reagan would nominate next on the court, D.C. Court of Appeals Judge Antonin Scalia. This would be Reagan's third appointment to the court also in 1986. Indeed, with the elevation of Rehnquist as Chief Justice, Reagan would appoint D.C. Court of Appeals Judge Antonin Scalia, who was arguably much more conservative than Rehnquist, to be an associate justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. All right. Scalia was fairly new on the D.C. Court of Appeals and thus hadn't developed a paper trail that long to substantially use against him by anyone who thought he might be too reactionary to be on the Supreme Court. And indeed, Reagan nominated Scalia to the court on June 24th, 1986, just 4 short days after he had nominated Rehnquist. Like I said, Scalia didn't really have confirmation troubles, and he was confirmed to the court by a 98-0 vote also on September 17th, 1986. All right, pardon me for using my references, but I want to be crystal clear in the references that I've written up as to these confirmation votes and specific dates. All right, and Scalia, of course, would go on to serve on the court from 1986 until his untimely death in 2016, all right, at the age of 79. Okay, Scalia had served nearly 30 years on the Supreme Court of the United States, and he too was a reliable and unrelenting and consistent conservative, hardly ever, if ever, breaking ranks, all right, with the conservatives, all right. Scalia was the first Italian-American justice to ever sit on the Supreme Court of the United States, and Italian-Americans, whether liberal or conservative, loved him, all right. He was certainly a home run for the conservative cause, believing in a strict textualist philosophy that did not embrace anything other than what the plain language of the Constitution would suggest, all right? He was a conservative's dream and a liberal's nightmare, all right? But he had enough charm to entertain you regardless of your stance on the political spectrum, all right? With all this in mind, none of these appointments would prepare President Reagan for what was coming with his fourth appointment in 1987. Indeed, at that point, Justice Lewis Powell, who had been appointed to the court by President Nixon in 1972, decided to retire. His health was not great. At this point, he was nearly 80 years old, and he figured it was time to go so that he could definitely have a Republican president to name his successor. Like I said, politically timed appointments are nothing new, all right? So Justice Powell decided to retire from the Supreme Court in the summer of 1987, which, was once again unleashed the hellhounds. Powell was a very moderate justice who was a swing vote in virtually every case that came before him. In contentious matters like abortion, civil rights, gay rights, Powell was the swing vote. Church-state separation, Commerce Clause cases, his vote mattered arguably the most, all right? How Powell voted was how the court went in most circumstances, all right? So to replace him, Democrats warned Reagan it's going to be war if you nominate the wrong person. All right. So I guess President Reagan decided to call him on that one. And with his first nomination, he submitted the great Robert Bork, a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. Judge Bork was an arch conservative, very, pretty much along the same lines as Justice Antonin Scalia, who had been appointed a year earlier. But Bork, unlike Scalia, was older and seemingly much more harsh in his views than Scalia presumably was. With Reagan's nomination of Bork, when I tell you every liberal interest group known to man came out against that nomination, they came out. NAACP, ACLU, you name it. I mean, all liberal public interest groups known to man came out against Bork, all right, stating that, with him on the court, segregation would be reapproved and women would have to get abortions in back alleys. Police would have a free reign to do whatever they wanted. And of course, all of this is total horse dung. Bork was not in any way the way he was described by the left as supporting a totalitarian America. Yes, he was conservative, but they're making the man seem like he was a step under Hitler, of which he was not. But nonetheless, the media carries the day under most circumstances, and the media had already convicted him. Robert Bork's nomination was one of the most contentious in Supreme Court history, and it is from his nomination that we got the verb borked. When a nominee is totally destroyed, in the confirmation process and ultimately rejected. And indeed, Robert Bork was rejected by the U.S. Senate, all right? So his confirmation rejection was 58-42, all right, on October 23rd, 1987. So Bork was out. He was what? Borked. Okay, so that brings us then to Reagan's second choice. D.C. Court of Appeals Judge, Douglas Ginsburg, all right? Judge Ginsburg was a relatively low-key nominee who could have probably easily been confirmed to the Supreme Court. He had served as a law clerk to Justice Thurgood Marshall in his younger days, and, he had taught in the past, okay? And, but what came out against him, remember, this is the conservative 80s, the anti-drug, just say no era. It had been revealed that Ginsburg had smoked marijuana. Ooh, what a horrible thing. Back in his younger days, while teaching and as a student, and that's a no-no. That was the 80s. You smoke marijuana back then, that's automatically a no-no for you. And that's, once that came out, Ginsburg was done, essentially, for all intents and purposes. And, he knew that. He knew the writing on the wall. And so, he told President Ronald Reagan to withdraw his nomination. He continued to serve as a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit for many years thereafter. I believe he's on senior status now at this point. Which brings us to the last potential nominee for Justice Lewis Powell's seat, which would go to U.S. Court of Appeals judge for the Ninth Circuit, Anthony Kennedy. You know that name, don't you? All right. Kennedy, was certainly the last choice for Reagan. Certainly wasn't Reagan's first choice. Kennedy was certainly not embraced by conservatives because he already had a reputation of being somewhat liberal, fearing that, not fearing, but holding that, the judiciary should play a much larger role in deciding controversies. Kennedy seemed to have soft spots for certain groups, and he felt that courts should essentially in many cases have more power than legislatures. All right, and Kennedy was certainly more desirable to moderates and liberals than to conservatives. But having lost two nominees already, essentially Reagan didn't really have a whole heck of a lot of people to choose from that would please both. And so, Reagan nominated Kennedy on November 30th, 1987 to the court. And, he was confirmed pretty easily, as, like I said, he had a reputation for being somewhat liberal. So the Democrats didn't really mount any opposition to him. Conservatives, greeted him with, cautious optimism that, this guy, overwhelmingly he's conservative, but he might be liberal from time to time. We will try to deal with that. And, ultimately, Kennedy was confirmed to the court by a vote of 97-0 in 1987. All right. And he would, 1987, 1988, and see, 97-0, hardly any opposition to him at all. And he became a justice on February 3rd, 1988. Okay. Kennedy would serve on the court, of course, for the next 30 years. All right. Well into the modern era. Okay. Until his retirement in July of 2018. All right. Okay. So we have the 4 Reagan appointees thus. Now, on the court, Kennedy was the moderate that he was perceived to be for virtually his entire time. Kennedy was a conservative. Make no mistake about it. Overwhelmingly, Kennedy was a conservative. He was not a liberal. And in my humble opinion, he wasn't really that much of a moderate. When it came to conservative causes, Kennedy was usually always there. Only with certain types of cases did his liberalism show. All right. That tended to be church-state separation. He was, which is a good thing, of course. He was always an ally of gay America. All right. He was an ally sometimes, okay, to defendants' rights. Okay, but he was definitely a liberal when it came to federal versus state power. All right. So, Kennedy was arguably the candidate for the court for both sides, ultimately, because he was not completely 100% committed to either side during his time on the bench, and certainly was a reliable conservative and certainly a predictable liberal in other circumstances. Okay. So thus, we have Reagan's 4 appointees. Sandra Day OConnor, who served from 1981 to 2006 and was succeeded by Justice Samuel Alito, appointed by President George W. Bush. We have Chief Justice William Rehnquist, who served in his role as Chief Justice from 1986 until 2005 and was succeeded by D.C. Court of Appeals Judge John Glover Roberts, who continues to serve to this very day, along with Justice Samuel Alito. Then we have to replace Justice Antonin Scalia, all right, who, of course, served from 1986 until his death in 2016. He was replaced by Justice Neil Gorsuch, who was appointed by President Trump in 2017, all right, and Justice Gorsuch continues to serve to this day. Okay, at the time of this recording. Next and last, we have U.S. Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy. So Kennedy served from 1988 until his retirement in 2018, when he was succeeded by Justice Brett Kavanaugh. All right, so the 4 Reagan appointees: Sandra Day OConnor, William Rehnquist as Chief Justice, Justice Antonin Scalia, and Justice Anthony Kennedy. All right, all having powerful impacts on the legacy of the court. Any questions, controversies, leave them down below and I'll be happy to answer them. If you like this video and learned a thing or two from it, drop me a like. I'd greatly appreciate it. And if you have not subscribed to my YouTube channel, I'd greatly appreciate it if you did so right now. Just hit that little red subscribe button and we'll be in business. It's totally free and you get updates when I post new videos. Okay, so again, thank you all so much for listening. It gives me great pleasure to teach about the Supreme Court and its history. All right, so you all take care, stay safe out there, be blessed in all you do, and I'll talk to you at the next video. Have a great day.